Philosophy Portal is a live event space. Every month, we host 4 live events dedicated to making philosophy actual. Our network is designed to explore the philosophy of sexuality, community, and metaphysics, as well as introduce you to some of the key thinkers in the underground theory scene. Members get access to the entire history of the live event space, as well as first access to special Philosophy Portal events. In the portal, we also encourage couples, as well as physical meetups when and where possible. If you are looking for a real thinking space, arguably the best thinking space online, check out philosophyportal.online and become a member today. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm Cadell Last, and I'm here today with David Burke, who's a doctoral student at Spa University. And we're here today to talk about the relationship between metal music and Lacanian psychoanalysis. David is writing his doctoral thesis and has already published some work on the topic, as well as having several papers that are currently still under review on the topic. I think it's really necessary to have a conversation at the intersection between some of this psychoanalytic and philosophical theory, as well as contemporary music scenes and cultural theory. So I'm really excited to see what emerges at the intersection of these two disciplines, or these two forms of knowledge, let's say. I think we should go in slowly and just sort of get a background first to sort of set the stage for some of your deeper theoretical work. But I guess in order to get that background, my first question would be, what is your history with specifically metal music? And then when did you start also becoming interested in, let's say, Lacan and psychoanalytic theory?
Right. Thank you very much, Cadel, for giving me an opportunity to communicate some of these ideas. So I got into metal when I was like 12 or 13, which is very normal for fans of the music. There must be something to do with puberty, perhaps the release of testosterone and other hormones, perhaps. And by the time I was about 16, I was already interested in writing about metal in an academic context. So I had a sense that I wanted to engage with this music in a theoretical or a serious manner very early on. But I didn't start reading psychoanalytic or philosophical theory until I had done my master's degree, because I did my first 2 degrees in history, and the dissertations for those I focused on doom metal, which was my favorite subgenre. Slow metal was my favorite subgenre world at that time, and those pieces were more focused on the aesthetics and then a little bit about the kind of politics of these genres. My master's was kind of considering how does doom metal mobilize freedom in various ways. But once I got beyond that, I was interested in writing something about for my PhD. I was interested in writing about how metal responds to or deals with capitalism, and from there I started to do deeper reading and actually engage with the scholarship for the first time. And around that point, I also started taking philosophy much more seriously than I had before. And I encountered a sublime object of ideology originally through the Epoch philosophy video summarizing it on YouTube. So again, it's not and I must stress, in fact, that my own reading of these thinkers is not comprehensive. I've done bits where I can, and there are some parts that I'm much more familiar with than others, and I'm really indebted to Todd McGowan. His work was incredibly influential on my own, but it's not a comprehensive reading. But when I read Sublime Object, I was suddenly convinced, or rapidly became convinced, that there was a whole slew of concepts at work in Hegelian and Lacanian theory which really apply to heavy metal music and culture. Prior to that, I'd started reading some other philosophies. I'd read a little bit of Anti-Oedipus and a couple of other, and I was also interested in stuff like Baudrillard, who I'm still influenced by. Once I read Lacan, and certainly the ideas of constitutive absence, and there's a kind of darkness to Lacan's work overall. There's this kind of and also a kind of magic. I think the algebra has this sort of alchemical quality to it, and as I and these aspects started to fit more and more snugly with heavy metal as I understood it. And from there, I became more and more interested in the ideas. And I'm currently writing my PhD, but I've already started discussions with Rosemary Overall from Otago in New Zealand, and she's a Lacanian, and we're planning a postdoctoral project trying to sort of really bring these concepts together.
Thank you so much for that background. And I really like this idea that puberty plays a huge role in sort of the our initial like in almost our transition from, at least for me, it was like this transition from, bland generic pop music to hard rock and sort of exploring more alternative genres from sort of the pop mainstream, and that it might sort of reflect certain affective tensions or effective dynamics that we're going through in our lives, and then sort of retroactively learning how to make sense of that with higher order theory. Why do you think heavy metal had an aesthetic appeal for you at the time it did? And are you still sort of making sense of that with theory, or is that just an ongoing process for you?
Oh my God, what a question. Because really the thing about musical enjoyment, right, is I think it forms part of the real of people's subjectivization, their self-narration, as it were. Music constitutes the kind of ineffable parts of these of our subjective journeys. So I think there's several ways to answer this question, and the first one is that the first time I became depressed, I think I was about 10 years old. Um, and I think in a more general sense, I experienced the kind of the chasmic confrontation of understanding the kind of nihilistic break that happens in puberty. I remember experiencing that quite young, realizing that meaning doesn't have the kind of solidity that the social givens tell us it has. You know, our parents, our school, what are the law, whatever. So I think there's a narrative thing going on, and I had an encounter with the real, perhaps, or the senselessness of the law, perhaps, very early on. But in a more general sense, I think the encounter with metal aesthetically, when I heard harsh vocals for the first time, and I can remember the time, date, where I was in my friend's living room, and it was Psychosocial by Slipknot playing on a Kerrang-esque rock TV station, and I was flawed. I had never heard such power before, and now what I understand really is that we're dealing with the excess of power, the kind of the overstepping of the signal, and distortion being this kind of marker of excessive power. And as with so many fans, I was completely hooked from that point. And many fans will describe this kind of process of discovering hard rock and metal, and then an additive journey towards heavier and heavier sounds, trying to find something that will scratch this itch. Very carefully chosen word there, I must insist.
Well, it's really a joy to read and confront your work, because even though my musical journey took a different direction from yours, I grew up in the same room as my brother for 20 years. And so we had sort of a music battle in our house between, I sort of went more in the direction of hip hop and he went in the direction of metal. And so I'm exposed deeply to a lot of the themes of metal, the subjective affects of metal, the way in which the music is being expressed vocally, and the reflection of the type of historical confrontation that you're mentioning in regards to the loss of social givens, the relationship to parental authority, the relationship to academics and scholarship and school and social law. And so, in some sense, my thinking here is that because of the way in which many people come into and become attracted to either metal music or, I guess, hip hop in a different way, it can become under theorized, or it can become under conceptualized, because a lot of the people who are going into metal music or going into alternative subgenres find themselves in an antagonistic relationship with academics, school, the law, and so forth. So at what moment did you find a unity between these two dimensions in some sense? Because usually people in those subcultures or those themes would find themselves on the outside of a doctoral program, but you find yourself on the inside of a doctoral program.
Yes, indeed. So popular culture studies as a field emerges in the late 1970s. And when it does, the initial group of scholars, so we're talking people like Stuart Hall and Dick Hebdiger, who some of our listeners may be familiar with offhand, they were very much focused on punk and dub subculture, musical subcultures that had a clear politics to them, had a clear resistance dynamic at play, or at least the scholars saw that and were very, very keen to read resistance in to these cultural practices. Metal was left by the wayside, despite it being prevalent at the time. There's a book called Subculture: The Meaning of Style by Dick Hebdiger, and he reserves his comments on metal to a single footnote buried at the back of the book, where he calls it hooligan music. It seems to him to be this combination of football terrace machismo and hippie aesthetics. He doesn't care for it at all. Now, by the early 1990s, you start to get a couple of scholars who are much more interested in actually reading metal sympathetically after a decade of largely derogatory studies from psychologists who are seeking research funding, and they do studies about the question over whether the transmission of transgressive lyrical content could lead to youth delinquency. That was the chief kind of question of the 1980s, was basically, does metal make kids bad? Now, from the 1990s, we start to get much more sympathetic readings. And by 2009, which is the year that I started to become properly interested in metal as a scholarly pursuit, a journal had just started, some conferences had just taken place, and the beginnings of the metal music studies field they were starting to cohere. And in this year, there was a documentary on the oh so legitimate BBC4 channel, which is the one that kids really shouldn't watch because it's just arts documentaries, history shows, nerd shit, frankly. Obviously, I was best placed. But there was a show called Heavy Metal Britannia broadcast on there, and it absolutely changed my life. Because I saw for the first time people talking about metal in a thorough and academic way. They weren't all academics. In fact, most of them weren't. Most of the people interviewed are journalists. But the idea of taking metal seriously thoroughly enamored me. The idea that this music, which to me felt like it had, to borrow several old puns, weight, a sense of density, a sense of profundity. To find that there were other people taking it this seriously absolutely was essential in me configuring my understanding of it. I think I was already kind of interested in writing in academia to some extent anyway, but it was precisely the legitimation of metal, which is something that I am commenting extensively on in my PhD. It was precisely this process of metal becoming more legitimated, entering the academy and at the same time entering establishment broadcast media, that was so pivotal in me coming to the point where I am now, where in my thesis I'm broadly discussing how normal metal has become and the implications that that has.
Now, there's a certain interesting historical tension that it would be, I think, worthwhile exploring, which is basically this relationship between what you're calling establishment media, the law, and a form of music which finds its origin in a rejection of the establishment, in its rejection of normalcy, not only rejection of law, but the recognition that the law is lacking, or a recognition that the law is itself either contradictory or somehow non-all. And I just want to see, what do you think are the stakes of this relationship between metal music as outside of the law and metal music becoming recognized and established within the law? Like, what are the stakes of this relationship? I'm interested in the historical stakes of the relationship between a form of music which has its origins in the lacking of the law, or the law as lacking, and becoming, in some sense, recognized by the establishment of education and law systems. What do you think are the long-term stakes, or even what are the underlying, perhaps unconscious dynamics between a form of music that finds itself in the lack and an agonistic expression of lack
Mm.
and becoming recognized by law? Like, what are the stakes of this historical relationship?
Right, great. So there are several things at issue here. The first is the prominence of the idea of transgression in metal. And when metal starts in the late 60s and really up until the 1990s and perhaps even a little bit further on from there, maybe into the 2000s, metal seems to be operating on this notion of transgressing the law, the Judas Priest song, breaking the law, etc. Breaking social taboos, then extending these taboos ever further. By the 1990s, you get cases where musicians are murdering each other or members of the public, in part to support their performative positions as musicians. But around the turn of the millennium, this energy starts to, in my analysis, this energy starts to wane. And it's also around this time that metal starts to become more and more legitimated by, say, the establishment media and by academia. It becomes something that is worthy of study. And later, as we enter the 2010s, it becomes more than worthy. It becomes something that is actually, very sensible to like metal, because have you seen how complicated the musicianship is? Oh, actually, we have this raft of studies now that shows that metal is good for you mentally. It's not something that's bad for you. It's not going to cause your kids to attack each other. Actually, it's a healthy, safe outlet for negative emotions, just like sports in some sense. And it starts to be viewed much more as a kind of useful tool for its fans, rather than something that genuinely poses a tension against the status quo. Now, part of the reason for this, I think, is the way in which capital is able to recuperate these cultural forms and these ideas. Obviously, metal is in this kind of uneasy, tense relationship with the culture industry from the get-go. I just finished reading a book about the way in how metal and punk inform each other. And the author contends that metal grasps the essentiality of performing in arenas much more than punk does. Metal grows up in the arena playing to 10,000, 5,000 people at a time. And that's the way that metal conceives of its massification. It reaches scores and scores of people, but it has to do so through the culture industry. So it's already caught up in this dynamic of recuperation from its inception. But by following 30, 40 years of this, it is almost so recuperated as to be completely normalized. And certainly, I think in the 2020s, that is where metal kind of rides. Now, that there are a few cases in which the kind of old logic of transgression persists, but overall, I think a lot of that has been replaced by what I would call ethical transgression, a kind of where you're breaking the law, but you're doing it in the right way. You're having your little sight of transgressive enjoyment, but actually the blind spot is visible to the law, and it condones this kind of enjoyment. We fully move from a dynamic of prohibition to a dynamic of permission, as per Zizek's conception of the postmodern. Now, what I want to claim is that there is a further dynamic that runs underneath this, because one of my central questions when I began the PhD was, how come that despite metal kind of losing its transgressive allure, it still remains popular, it still remains big? It can't just be that we like regurgitation that much, because then the fans inside it would start to notice it and realize that the bottom is falling out of the thing, and they would start leaving. So I propose that what actually drives metal underneath this relationship to transgression or its relationship to a kind of ethical enjoyment is, per McGowan, enjoyment for its own sake. That is to say, metal's grounding dynamic, the thing which really underpins the whole thing, is jouissance for jouissance's sake. And as we get further into the development of metal historically, I think that this is going to become more apparent, but it is going to be set against the increasingly prominent dynamic of ethical enjoyment, ethical jouissance, where I know that I'm doing something that's bad and maybe self-destructive and maybe silly, but it's healthy and it's been condoned by some big other. Whereas what I want to propose is really we need to punch past this and recognize the horror that we enjoy metal for the sake of doing stupid things to ourselves for fun.
It reminds me of the dynamic that Zizek points out about wanting coffee without caffeine, or Coca-Cola without sugar, or to have the burger but still be thin, or something like that. Like you want the jouissance, but I think that's what you're saying, is this ethical enjoyment condoned by the big other, and not this sort of horror of the jouissance in and for itself. And
Yes,
and
yes.
also to make, in the historical dynamic you're pointing out, that there seems to be a genuine historical progress of a certain sense in regards to the relationship between law and jouissance. Like, to not just have a law that's purely prohibition, but to have a law that can actually withstand the horror of jouissance. Is that what you see?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I see yeah, as I said, a kind of increasing replacement of the prohibitive model of transgression, where metal fans of old would enjoy seeing Satan purely because it goes against the norm, because it's not like the regular things that you see, because they know that it breaks the rules in some way, but they don't have to think it through. The level of transgressive enjoyment is, oh well, I got to break the rules, and isn't that fun? And they told me no, but I'm going to do it anyway. And but you don't have to consider the content of what you're tarrying with at all. You just wave the offensive symbol. We've now proceeded to, yeah, like an ethical enjoyment where you're doing the offensive symbol, but actually there's this rational basis for it. We're not just doing it purely to shock people. Oh no, we're doing it because there's a genuine reason for upholding Satan in the face of this despotic, evil Christianity, etc. There's a reason for attacking the state because of various political indiscretions, etc., etc., etc. I think the one of the primo examples of this for me, there's a band who I won't name to save the shame of it, but they're blowing up at the moment in the UK, and their bio quote is a little quote from The Guardian saying, "This is how heavy metal should be done." And I think that perfectly sums up this kind of ethical enjoyment that metal now finds itself in. So, yes, absolutely, we're seeing metal kind of trace the development of postmodernity in the law in its relationship to enjoyment.
There's a line I last year at Philosophy Portal I taught Lacan's Ecrit, and there's a line in the Ecrit where Lacan says, Christianity has not paid enough attention to God's jouissance, or God's enjoyment. And I'm getting this sort of interpretation from what you're talking about, the history of metal, going from metal fans enjoying, let's say, transgressing the law of a certain normative traditional Christianity because we're not allowed to enjoy. We have to sort of pay attention to God as prohibition, and we have to pay attention to God as specifically a prohibition of jouissance, towards accommodating our jouissance to a certain ethical standard, towards basically paying attention to jouissance and enjoyment as such. And that's actually where we have a more authentic relationship to God. That's actually where we have a more authentic relationship to something divine or supernatural, that there is a weird way in which metal is actually approaching a religious or a theological dimension. And I'd be interested to know how you're making sense of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my take on this has consistently been metal is religion without God. Metal is religion it's the religious form that persists in the era of the death of God. And loads of other metal scholars have intimated something very, very similar to this. Is the way in which metal captures a kind of a ritualistic aesthetic. That's fairly evident, but also a whole slew of practices around keeping local community, around but also a sense, if not actually substantiated, of a kind of global community of followers, which is much more pronounced than in other youth musical subcultures. For like hip hop, which you mentioned before, hip hop tends to be more scenic, more focused on the local. Its particular scenes and how, and obviously there's some sense in which hip hop broadly and historically refers to a an African American culture, and there is some unity to be found there. But once hip hop spreads beyond that and becomes a global musical culture, which it now is, with scenes in basically every country in the world, those scenes don't interact with each other in the same way. Whereas metal scenes globally like to think of themselves as connected to some kind of broader community, even if in actuality there's loads of economic and social disparities between the individual local scenes. So absolutely, I think that metal, as and certainly as metal approaches the idea of jouissance for jouissance's sake, as we get to a kind of a more authentic enjoyment, absolutely, this is the moment where metal can kind of, or there's the potential anyway. I don't think it will necessarily manifest out of the current set of economic and social conditions that metal's found itself in. It's too recuperated. But there absolutely lies the potential for its fans to understand how they're effectively carrying on a religious form. Right now, however, I would argue that a lot of the community is too irony poisoned, too postmodern, as it were, to actually grasp this and would rather continue to indulge in transgressive or ethical play of enjoyment rather than take enjoyment seriously.
That's fascinating. And I would love to, before going deeper into that religious form, just get a little bit of background about how you see metal interacting with other subversive music genres. You've already mentioned punk, you mentioned hip hop. There may be some other music genres which come from the 1960s countercultural revolution, and broadly speaking, the last half of the 20th century, which are perhaps representing this move from enjoyment of transgression to enjoyment as such. I think that perhaps punk could also be seen in this way, perhaps hip hop could also be seen in this way, but I'd love to get your background on how you see, let's say, the ecology of musical
Oh,
enjoyment.
one of my favorite questions, to be honest. I love this question. Metal, one of its uniquenesses is that it has no good grounding. It has no rational basis. Punk has a rational basis. It is the music which is about politics. It relates to politics. That is I think its fundament. The thing that makes something punk is has nothing to do with the sound and everything to do with a stance in relation to the big other, where really punk is the one that mobilizes ethical enjoyment the best. It is the one that is most and this is perhaps unpopular, but I think for that reason, punk is the most liberal of the popular music cultures because it is the most concerned with pointing out how you should and shouldn't act and what is the right way to do something within a system that is patently unfair. Yet the punk feels the need to carve out a place in which ethics are properly substantiated. Then you can look at hip hop and reggae and the ways in which folk musics are also brought into popular music. And in here, we have another rational basis. We have history, a real concrete history tied to a particular culture, a particular people, and this popular music serves as a way of not just them coming to terms with their position and making sense of their own world, but then also the hegemons in which these cultures have been placed as subaltern. The hegemon also comes to an understanding of what those cultures are through these. It must be noted, of course, that the number one audience for hip hop was suburban white boys, not necessarily that they were the people that bought the most hip hop records more than the black communities, and it's through those that white America actually came to some kind of understanding about the place that Black America could have in its culture, i.e., as a kind of recapitulation of the minstrel figure. Frankly, at its worst, at its best, we see the idea of black excellence come to the fore and genuinely change the culture, stuff like Kendrick's work and so on being fully legitimated, I think is a good example of that. Dance music, electronic dance, also has a good rational basis. It's fun. We go out, we have a nice time, we dance with our friends, we meet people, we explore each other's bodies. Bodies being, I think, the kind of sine qua non of dance music. It's the most Deleuzian. It's the most immanentized. It's the most focused on the ways in which bodies, flows, and kind of lines of flight, subjective in subjective terms, occur. Now, metal doesn't really have anything. Metal just has, oh, it's loud, and that's good. And then later, as metal, and even from the 70s, and certainly in the 80s, there was a whole load of songs which metal kind of justifies itself by saying, well, rock music is good. There are so many AC/DC songs, Twisted Sister songs, Manowar, obviously, perhaps the most famous for writing songs that are just about how great metal is. So there's this kind of recursive grounding to metal, which to me is very interesting because it means that metal doesn't really have a proper grounding at all. It self-justifies, which really indicates that nothing given substance is the grounding for metal proper, which is why we have the aesthetic fascination with black, with death, with nothing, with various forms of nothingness, with lack, and so on and so on. These are all ways of communicating the central theme to metal, which is that it doesn't have a proper grounding. It just has this yawning chasm of existential anguish, which it opens onto. It opens onto the real, but that is no justification for its existence because the real doesn't provide any rationality. So in that sense, metal has this unique position where it's not properly substantiated. It doesn't have a good concrete reason for its existence beyond the fact that we like things that are very loud.
All right, so I'd like to stay with this for a bit. I wouldn't say that I'm going to push back, but I do want to probe a little bit deeper.
Please.
But I do appreciate what you're outlining here. And I think it's not discussed enough. There's a few things. So first, to bring in a little theory, Hegel's got this weird quote in The Philosophy of Right, the well-known quote, "The real is rational, the rational is real." And in The Phenomenology of Spirit, he also has this really interesting quote that basically says, "The true hangs on the idea that the absolute is substance, but also subject." So I want to bring in both of these dimensions here to approach what I think you're pointing towards with the punk, the hip hop, the electronic, and the metal. What I interpret you saying is that punk, hip hop, and electronic music have a substantial ground, and metal does not have a substantial ground. And that metal's ground is the subject itself. And that then the only grounding for metal is the subject's own enjoyment. The only grounding for metal is the subject's own jouissance, whereas perhaps punk, hip hop, and electronic obfuscate or foreclose or somehow do not hold together on the level of the real of the subject itself, but rather some sort of substantial antagonism, like, for example, hip hop with race relations in the United States, or punk in regards to neoliberal political order and how we can become ethical subjects in regards to neoliberal political order. I guess the idea that I want to throw at you in regards to my own thinking through hip hop is the enjoyment of the signifier. That in, for example, freestyle, or for example, just rhyming for rhyming's sake, that there is a certain enjoyment in just the freedom of the signifier, that it's not anything about race relations or transgression of white and black, but just there's a certain enjoyment in being able to, like Lacan says, the subject is what relates a signifier to another signifier.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
I'm just enjoying, and like, why am I doing this podcast in the end? You
Right,
know, I'm
right.
enjoying the play of signifiers. I'm playing with the signifiers in a certain way, and there is a sort of substantial mission that I'm involved in. Like, I do care about the certain philosophy that I'm happen to be engaged in. I do think that it's important for a larger political movement and a certain engagement with academia, and I'm in the cracks of academia, and I'm trying to find a space for the real mediation of signifiers, but I could boil it down to the enjoyment of signifiers as such. And what I want to throw back at you is the possibility that we haven't yet explored the connections between metal, punk, hip hop, and electronic on the level of the enjoyment of the signifier, and that there's a space for this dialogue.
That's superb. So the first when you said that, as you talked about hip hop and the love of the signifier, the first thing that came to mind was Rapper's Delight, and the first line of Rapper's Delight, where he's just saying a hip, a hop, a hippy divvy, and it doesn't matter. The words don't mean anything in this moment. Now, what? Now, let's break this the fuck down because this is fascinating stuff. So, in hip hop, we have this kind of the flow of signifiers. Surely that is the great thing. That's the enjoyment of the signifier that happens there. In punk, it's the slogan. It's or the edict is the key thing. Boiling down all of that rage into one phrase that you can bellow, that you can shout, that has the right meaning, that has the right ethics, that condenses your belief into the right signifier. Dance, electronic music, doesn't have a relation to the signifier at all. It's not about the signifier. It's about it's about what escapes the signifier. It's about the body. Now, obviously, there are words that come up in dance music, but a lot of the time, the vocal samples are repetitive and simple because it's not about that. The feel, perhaps, the grain of what a word feels like to say, perhaps, is the thing there. Metal, now, metal's favorite thing, if you don't mind, I'll give you a brief. Now, that is the moment at which in Rosemary Overell's really excellent article from 2021, she talks about the metal voice as real, and she relates it to the work of Mladen Dolar and the object voice, which is this thing that if we were to strip the voice of its signifier, what would we have? And Dolar in his book, he's not a metal fan, but he hints at the idea that screaming is pretty close to the object voice, as are other things like coughing or like clearing one's throat, so getting pretty close there. But yes, the scream, the metal's thing that it adds musically on the level of the signifier gets us to the object voice, basically the cry of anguish, the thing that escapes signification yet is still bound to our process of enunciation. And that I think is key here, because when we listen to screams, they can have signifiers in them, and often metal lyrics are devilishly complicated and feature all manner of $20 words. You know, they love a long word, but it's not about hearing them. It's about actually having them obscured, having them masked. And yes, there is this kind of enjoyment of the grain of pronouncing. That's definitely there. But also there's an enjoyment in not understanding it.
All right, let's stay here for a bit. So I love, for example, I mean, I think this is a great cartography, first off. So we have with punk, we have finding the right signifier, as it were, the signifier that fits, or the
The quilt,
signifier.
perhaps even something to quilt.
Yeah, a quilting point.
Yes.
A certain political quilting point that has to be inscribed within an ethical system.
Yes.
That there is an importance to, that the signifier can't just be foreclosed for the body, that the signifier can't just be stripped to the scream, that the signifier can't just be this flow of relation, but has to be the right signifier, has to be the ethical signifier. Then we have the dance, the electronic, that where we have no relationship to the signifier, just the body, maybe even the body without organ or something like that,
Very
because you said
much.
it's the most Deleuzian.
Yes.
And so we have this idea that dance and electronic. I also see it as dance and electronic. I've also made this connection previously that dance and electronic is kind of anti-Oedipal. That there's
Mm.
again this relationship to undifferentiation,
Yes,
the
very much.
collective body without differentiation. Whereas I've often thought that hip hop really depends on differentiation. That hip hop, the story of the signifier is important.
Very much.
This is
Yeah.
obviously finding its ground and voice originally in subaltern, marginalized African American communities, but is about the struggles of differentiation. And I think that that's important to emphasize, and that
Yes.
here the relation of signifier to signifier does matter in some sense in regards to the differentiation of the subject within a certain unethical substance. And then the idea of metal as the scream, the object voice as such. And I like that connection to Dollar. And I've also had some friends who were talking about this object voice on the level of being interested in the way they cough or being interested in the way they clear their throat. I just actually listened to a podcast of a friend who was working through the mystery of that for himself. And so I like that connection to the scream, and that's something related to the object voice. So the question I want to throw out to you here, we've got this sort of cartography of music and its relationship to the law and different ways that the modern subject is trying to explore its relationship to the law in a postmodern condition. Is something about the way in which metal and hip hop, I think, have a weird relationship that appears in genres like nu metal, that
Mm.
appears in bands like Linkin Park. And
Yeah.
for a moment, there was the possibility of a huge crossover dialogue, which never really went anywhere, it seems to me.
Mm.
But that what I want to throw out to you in a sort of Hegelian sense is that you said metal has the global scream. So I'm going to throw this out to you. So metal has a global scream, and that
Mhm.
this might be situated in your idea of universal negativity.
Yes.
Whereas hip hop has the local particularity and it embodies community struggle and maybe in some ways ethnic struggle. But I would also say beyond ethnic struggle, I would say I see hip hop class struggle, and that this is embodied in the differentiation of local particularity. And so there's a dialogue here between local particularity and class struggle and global scream of the object voice as such.
I think you've got it in one. I think that's absolutely what I think. That yes, for me, metal is this kind of carrier of negative universality. It offers itself. It can be for everyone. And the way that metal spreads across the world, and the way and as I say, the way in which its fans conceive of themselves, even if it's not actually played out properly. And there are so many examples of, one group of metal fans being abhorrent to others on all kinds of social grounds. The way in which the fans largely conceive of themselves as belonging to some kind of global community indicates for me that this kind of enjoyment of anguish, as you brilliantly articulated, it's something that is grounded really in the divided subject. This is a universal popular music in the way that whereas hip hop is much more the agglomeration of particulars. It's this 1+1+1+1 of different scenes, which are all articulating particular local political struggles. Now, these find there are local particular political struggles that are played out in metal too, and there are scholars in America who have spent a lot of time working with Latin American metal, especially to show how various metal bands engage with local politics. But I think that this is not anywhere near as central to how the culture articulates itself overall as it is in the way that hip hop does. Hip hop fundamentally is concerned with personal stories, I think. As you were saying, it's fundamentally about my block, my place, my people, getting through my life, and by turn offering advice on a one-to-one level to the listener. This is how I got through this situation. If you meet this kind of person, this is how you should interact with them. Nor, it's practical ethics very much, or it can be a lot of the time. Obviously, there's psychedelic and other kinds of hip hop too that are a little more abstract. Fine. In the same way, there's some metal which is very on the street and is more punk or hip hop influenced and tends to be more practical. But I think metal overall, you see the themes that it deals with, they're abstractions. Metal deals with perhaps the noumenal, or is dealing with, as a more commonly, I just call it the real. It is dealing with these kind of abstractions of universal problematics, which is why you get these certain locus of symbols which cohere around death and destruction, because these really are the grounds for a negative universality, is a realization that we all share the experience of death, loss, violence, and destruction. These are the things which everybody can see themselves in. We can't all see each other in the particulars of concrete situations. We can try and empathize, but we cannot as immediately relate to them as we can by seeing, I don't know, a human skull.
So here I wanna continue playing around with the global scream and the local particularity in regards to the content of these genres, because like you're saying, in hip hop, we do see really what's fundamental, the personal story. Like you're saying, my block. I do think practical ethics is a big part of it, and I also like the way you're calling it the one by one. I think that that's another accurate way of describing it. This agglomeration of particulars. And then on the level of metal, what it seems to me is that the content, which seems to be mega historically important, which is being worked out, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the content which seems to be working out, I would say, is on the level of Christianity and atheism. It's on the level of the death of God. It's on the level of Satan. It's on the level of the death of God theology, our relationship to evil, and reconciling ourselves with this abyssal, groundless jouissance, and like you're saying, brings us to the noumenal and the real in a certain type of way. However, the way I see hip hop engaging the real and the way I see hip hop engaging, let's say, jouissance, is much more engaged in this, I would say, historical parallax between sexual difference and class difference. That
Mm,
hip hop has a certain engagement with sexual difference, working out of the masculine and the feminine, also class difference, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which is being worked out relative to different communities, relative to different ethnicities and different nationalities, but nevertheless on this level of sexual difference and class difference, but not so much, it seems to me, on the level of global religiosity or global atheism.
mm.
And so I guess what I'm trying to say here is, what is the relationship on the one hand between metal and sex difference and class difference? And what is the relationship between hip hop and religiosity and atheism? Because I feel like that's where there's like the missing conversation.
Oh, that's really good. Okay, so I think metal's relationship to section class difference, firstly, is hotly contested in the scholarship. Really, really tense discussions, especially around how gender works in metal, because lots of women join metal scenes and find it extremely unpleasant to be in. My supervisor discusses in his book, which is now nearly 20 years old, about how women would stand in a circle of all other men and they wouldn't be referred to by their name. They'd be referred to as ex's girlfriend. They're right there in the circle, never addressed properly. I want to posit, and now on the flip side, there are also scholars that talk about how metal can be very empowering for women because finally they don't have to be treated as objects in quite the same way. They're not given so much of the gaze as they are in normative social situations. Now, what I want to posit is that following one scholar who talks about how metal ex scribes women, i.e., they don't really exist a lot of the time in metal's content on the lyrics, is that metal deals with sexual difference precisely through the Lacanian aphorism of the woman does not exist. Now, what I want to add to this is that it has none of the subtlety and grace by which that aphorism normally operates. When metal thinks that the woman does not exist, it means literally women basically don't count a lot of the time. They are just written out, or they are returned in the form of two archetypes. The first one is the over adorned sex object, as is in the case of the female fronted metal genre, in which you have a stereotypically attractive woman being the singer, and the rest of the band often stand in darkness or in shadow so that they're not even visible, because that's not what it's about. It's about objectification.
In
The
pop
other side,
culture, in pop culture, this would be Evanescence.
Evanescence, Nightwish, lesser known bands would be like Epica and so on. The other way that this goes is that women are actually welcomed as one of the boys, and they're treated as a man. And in kind, they often dress more masculine. These kinds of women often get to have more prominent positions in the operation of metal scenes. They will be the people that book shows, that get things done, and people respect them a lot more, perhaps, than the women who go into metal and participate in this objectification. So metal has a really unpleasant and complicated relationship with gender, is what I'm trying to articulate, and it's actually kind of similar, I think, in some ways to the way hip hop orients itself. On the class struggle thing, I think you get hints of you've got another odd juxtaposition. You Some singers and bands really articulate a kind of metal universality. There are lots of songs about, just destroying not just a particular law because it's bad or a particular institution, but the destruction of all laws. A kind of very lumpen anarchism can sometimes pervade in metal discourses. But then on the other side, you get the complete opposite. There are some subgenres which really hammer home a kind of right Nietzschean might makes right elitism, where only the true cult are in the know, and they're the only people that deserve to be fully free subjects, and people that don't get it, well, let them go to the slaughter, as it were. We don't even care, and it gets extremely hyperbolic to I think perhaps the definitive phrase on this would be kill all posers. A poser being somebody who is false, who doesn't like metal sufficiently or doesn't like the right bands or so on. And you get this kind of, well, destroy all of them. Now, hip hop has a particularity which separates it, I think, from this. Hip hop might be more on the line of destroy white supremacy, for instance. But I don't think it would go as far as to say destroy the entire world and let us dance in the ashes of it. Less common. Now, on the religiosity of hip hop and its relation to religion and atheism, I think hip hop is far more prone than metal to insert the musician themselves as a kind of deified figure,
Yes.
as a kind as perhaps more commonly as a monarch is maybe a little fairer, but certainly I
Very
think,
fair.
but
Because
certainly I
there's regional kings.
now there are some of the names for the most famous metal musicians are, for instance, the Prince of Darkness. That's Ozzy Osbourne. Rob Halford of Judas Priest is sometimes called the Metal God. So it's not like either culture
No,
is
and in
barred from the discursive framings of the other. But I think hip hop is, of the two, far more likely to insert the musician themselves as the new god, as they fully take on the kind of one interpretation of the death of God, which is, well, if God's dead, then we can take on this mantle. We are the only ones that have any kind of substantiality or grounding in the world, and through capital, I can adorn myself and make myself into a godlike being. Now, in metal, this is not as apparent. And in fact, the huge proliferation of metal bands that do not make any money, I think indicates that you're much more likely, rather than to think when getting into metal, oh, I'm going to be able to adorn myself with all of this finery and become a sort of minor deity. Rather, you think, oh, I'm going to lose all my money and nobody's ever going to recognize this. And like, I'm going to be playing thousands of chords to 3 people for the rest of my life. I've got to lift my amps everywhere I go. I've got to lift all of this stupid gear everywhere, because if I don't have it, I won't be loud enough, and other bands will look at me and say that I'm weak, for instance. Whereas I think in hip hop, the dream, the idealization of what it is to be a rapper is much more bound up with an idea of an individual rising to great heights and great success.
Absolutely. So, get rich or die trying,
That's it.
for example, or like started from the bottom, now I'm here.
Whereas Lemmy has this idea, the Motorhead slogan is "Born to lose, live to win."
Hmm.
Right? So you start off with the recognition that you suck. You are a loser. In Lemmy's case, you are the ugliest guy in the band.
Right.
You
And I
know?
do think that I've actually written on this that I do think that of all the genres, hip hop, what I've argued is that hip hop mobilizes the historicity of kingship more than any other genre. Because
Ooh.
because in all other genres, pop, you have the king of pop is Michael Jackson. You
Mm.
even have the king of rock and roll, you have Elvis Presley.
Yeah.
You have the kingship mobilized in other genres, but only in hip hop do you have the active competition for kingship, where the actual historical living artist is fighting in their song to become king, to be
Mm.
crowned king
Mm.
while they're alive, not retroactively once it's all said and done.
Yes. Yes.
So this is an interesting dimension of it, which I do think plays into the way in which in hip hop there's a historicity of differentiation, which is at stake, and this rising to prominence, which you've been saying, which
Mm.
is not so much seen in the other genre. But at the same time, like you're saying, in hip hop, you would have someone like Tupac say it's me against the world. But in this sense, me against the world is basically me against white supremacy, me against a certain political system,
Yeah.
but not me against ontological existence as such,
Yes, indeed.
right?
Indeed.
Whereas in metal, I see much more not just a particular historical social system is the problem, but any possible historical social system, and the very ground of being is rotten.
Yes. I think that's precisely it.
And
Is that
so in metal, you do have this universal negativity which is appearing, where it's the reason why you probably don't have this rise to fame or this rise to kingship or this I was at the bottom but now I'm at the top. But you have this idea that there is no top to rise to because everything is fundamentally rotten at its core.
I think that's more the case, yes. And
And so
that
there's this relationship between the universal negativity and the local particularity, which is that place where there's, again, I think there's a lot at stake in the dialogue. And I think that on the one hand, I would say that in hip hop, the woman does exist as an object.
mm,
The woman exists as an objectification oftentimes. And I think that this is but this also has a historicity to it because historically speaking, women have been marginal characters in the story of hip hop. Whereas
mm,
today, in the 2020s especially, women are rising much more to the level of the biggest stars in hip hop. Like
very
the
true.
biggest artists in hip hop in the 2020s, selling music wise and success wise, are oftentimes women. They're more actually coming into the spotlight more.
Mm,
Whereas historically speaking, they almost didn't exist, but they were
yes.
always the constant object and muse and inspiration, whether it's in the club or in some other capacity. But now rising to the level of the voice. So I think there is a historical dimension to this, but I think the crucial thing is that the place, and this is where I want to throw it back to you, is I think the place where woman occupies the object of jouissance is there in hip hop, whereas it seems like in metal this is more an ambiguous or negative dimension, almost as if in metal, what's being foregrounded is the sexual non relationship and the fact that the woman does not exist. And then, as a consequence, and this is where I'll throw it back to you, as a consequence of that, actually, the metaphysical dimension of God and Satan and atheism and Christianity becomes the central conversation. Nihilism and the death of God becomes the central conversation and not the sexual difference or the class question.
Yes. So historically, this takes time. So when metal emerges out of hard rock, questions around sexual difference and class difference are more important to metal. In the 1980s, the glam metal genre, things like Motley Crue and at its lightest, things like Bon Jovi, are still very much focused on objectifying women. Very much. But they still don't exist very outside of glam. They barely exist in metal texts. But once the extreme metal subgenres start emerging more fulsomely in the 1990s, I'm talking about black metal, death metal, grindcore, sludge metal, when these emerge, the questions around sexual and class difference start to fall away much more rapidly. And questions around ontology, yes, the problem of evil, the innate kind of paucity of religion in the 20th century, these start to become much more central, yes. And I think this in really is metal starting to lose its particularity, in fact, because metal does have a particularity when it starts. The particularity, however, is white, upper working, lower middle class, male. That was the particularity at its inception. It is basically average Joes within the hegemonic framework. Normal white English and American men. Basically people who are in the most normal of socioeconomic normal quote unquote of socioeconomic classes. But as metal becomes more popular, and then as it gets louder, darker, faster in some cases, slower in others. As it becomes more sonically extreme, the themes which rise to the surface ever more start to get more universal.
So what I want to throw out here is the idea that okay, so I'm gonna first build on what you're saying. So metal in its historicity did have a particularity in its beginning, and that particularity was related to sex, ethnicity, and class, the white upper working class average Joe. I would say that, as you already mentioned, hip hop has its particularity more in the black lower class American struggle, and that I would argue that as hip hop has become universalized, there is definitely a movement away from that particularity. But at the same time, that particularity still seems to have historical stakes, specifically in the never ending discourse about the acceptance of white male rappers, or the fact that the white male rapper can never escape the fact that he's a white male rapper. Like, no matter how successful or no matter how culturally or artistically or critically acclaimed, a white male rapper will always be a white male rapper and see that as the first sort of identity badge. So it's harder for that particularity to be escaped, as it were. And I
Yes.
think that maybe on that level, there's again this, and I would also say, as metal has escaped its particularity towards universality, would you say it's also lost touch with particularity? Is there a need for a dialectic between universality and particularity, where metal needs to reparticularize itself and hip hop needs to more universalize itself? How do you see that playing out?
In the past 10 years, there has been a new kind of fusion of hip hop and metal emerge between trap and metalcore, and to a lesser extent black metal. Now, I see in this as a really good opportunity for metal to kind of re-engage with particularity. And we also see this in the current ethical enjoyment upholding of various albums by bands from Latin America, from the global South more broadly, from places from India, from Indonesia, where there's a huge death metal scene in Indonesia. Well, it's the biggest metal scene outside of the West. And the way that the fans engage with this on the one hand can be very good, and it can reparticularize and suggest, yes, and this is related to the works by those American academics I mentioned before, where they are identifying, yes, these are moments where metal can become part of a particular struggle, be meaningful, be part of something local, and not just be content to drink beer and half philosophize late at night. Simultaneously, I also think that hip hop, as it becomes more metal, has these opportunities for it to start considering darker questions, a more philosophical inquiry, perhaps, and an approach which is less grounded in particularity. Now, I also don't think, while both of these genres remain firmly part of a capitalist culture industry, I don't think they're going to be let out of their respective gates, because I think actually universality being mobilized for a largely white male audience is very, very convenient for that audience. It allows them to not, for instance, see how they are bound up to particular political struggles. And simultaneously, I think that keeping hip hop so grounded around the African American experience also keeps it contained and prevents it from getting out of a certain kind of Orientalism. So I think that while there is definitely more dialectic to go, and I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, before I started the PhD, starting to wonder about a pop music where no genre boundary existed, where all of this sectarian nonsense over, well, you can't listen to this and you can't listen to that, when all of that has melted away, I was really intrigued to hear what that would sound like. And we're kind of, each year we get a little bit closer to the realization of that. And that for me is very exciting. But I think for the minute, the dialectic is going to be somewhat arrested.
Philosophy Portal is a live event space. Every month, we host 4 live events dedicated to making philosophy actual. Our network is designed to explore the philosophy of sexuality, community, and metaphysics, as well as introduce you to some of the key thinkers in the underground theory scene. Members get access to the entire history of the live event space, as well as first access to special Philosophy Portal events. In the portal, we also encourage couples, as well as physical meetups when and where possible. If you are looking for a real thinking space, arguably the best thinking space online, check out philosophyportal.online and become a member today. Fantastic. So I'm really happy we were able to explore all of this in great detail before really, at least in my mind, this just functions as a preamble or a preface to some of the more core theoretical dimensions that you explore in your work. And the first one I want to really touch on is the way in which you are mobilizing monstrosity in your work, the way in which monstrosity connects to extimacy,
Mm,
and the way in which that points towards subjectivity in the real. But I just want to say that even though that you're centering here, and we can specifically focus on the way that you're centering metal music, I would be really interested to also explore the way in which monstrosity, extimacy, subjectivity in the real appears in music as such. But
mm.
just be maybe good to hear you first sort of frame how you're starting to approach these themes.
Yeah, and I really want to bounce off that point. Like, I'm really interested in wedding psychoanalytic theory to pop music studies more broadly. But I think I have alighted on metal not just because, well, maybe just because I am a fan, but also because metal is very obvious in the way that it mobilizes psychoanalytic concepts. Like, there are labels called Turderstrieb in metal. That's how blatantly metal mobilizes the concept of death drive, is that it just names labels after death drive. And in other genres, they tend to have a bit of grace, subtlety, tact, something to smooth over the sort of gurgling psychodynamics that are at the heart of how musical enjoyment works on the subject. You cover it over with something, as I've kind of previously related. There are various mechanisms by which genres provide a basis for which they don't have to think about the kind of nonsensical, ineffable nature of enjoying music. getting past, so let's now explore the monstrosity ecstasy idea. So for me, the thing that makes a monster in the eyes of the big other is the admission of and dealing with objet art. Objet art is the way in which ecstasy in Lacan certainly is manifested. It's this thing that is radically other to us, that is also deep inside. It's the core thing that actually makes us, is the shape of the gap, as it were. What shape does this lack take? And therefore what shape do you look for in the world of commodities or desirable objects in order to attempt to fit into this gap? Now, I would say that that objet art is precisely concomitant with the form of the monster that we as subjects take. And I want to say that the subject is basically identical with our monster to begin with. It's this assemblage of grotesque, misshapen parts. You know, the body doesn't fit its language. The language doesn't fit its culture. The culture doesn't fit its politics. None of these things actually work. They have this fundamental failure in their interaction between each other. And that's one way in which monsters are kind of born. But then there's also the operation of the big other, as I mentioned before. The big other is the thing which designates what a monster is in relation to some kind of norm. Now, the thing that metal does is claim, as I said in my lecture from a few years ago, metal claims monstrosity for its own. It takes on and willingly bears this notion that we are imperfect, that we're kind of raggedy Frankenstein creatures, rather than being a whole and perfect and completed subject, as oddly enough is the conventional doctrine. You know, the normative ideology is to make oneself whole, to make oneself at peace with the imperfections in one's life. What's the slogan I see on many a mum walking up and down the high street is perfectly imperfect, which I think, which really grasps from the opposite side what this should be. For me, it should read the other way around. It should read imperfectly perfect, because I think that would much better grasp the candle. But perfectly imperfect says that no, it's okay to be. You can be at ease with objet art. You can make peace with this restlessness, this horror that drives all of your activity and all of your enjoyment. Whereas metal says no, actually. No, you have to throw yourself, fall, as Zizek likes to talk about, fall into the constant struggle of trying to make sense of this thing that resists all attempts to make sense of it.
Amazing. So I would say, like, I just want to focus on what you were saying in this line of reasoning, where basically this line of reasoning that points towards not fitting and the impossibility of fitting. And also we could say the sort of the universality of the non-relation and the universality of negativity. So the body doesn't fit in language. The language doesn't fit in culture. The culture doesn't fit in politics. I would even say the body doesn't fit in physics. It's like there's this, there's this dimension of not fitting, which is at all levels. And that you're saying that it's in this not fitting where monsters are born, and that this monster is co-equal with subjectivity itself. And that what the historicity of this music, even I would argue the entire field, metal, punk, dance, hip hop, all of these forms of music which are in the beginning transgressing and then trying to reconcile with ethics and then pointing towards jouissance as such, is that what we're trying perhaps to give birth is the monstrousness of subjectivity itself. That the subject is a monster, and that oftentimes why we either repress or foreclose or disavow is because we are unable to come to terms with our own monstrousness. And maybe these forms of music are ways of dealing with the drive that are superior to repression, are superior to foreclosure, are superior to disavowal.
I certainly think so. And I think the special thing for metal compared to the others is that metal is supremely bad at repression. Not just that it doesn't like it and that it wishes to drag this stuff up, but the kinds of people who like metal are there's a lot of autistic men in metal. I want to just and that's kind of what my postdoc empirically will be focusing on, is trying to formally empirically show the metal to autism connection. And the thing about autism is that people are very tactless. They're not very good at repression, and they say things that they shouldn't say. For that reason, metal is very instructive. It helps us to understand precisely what you're articulating, which is that popular music post the 1960s is really a series of attempts to deal with the existential break that begins at the advent of postmodernity at the end of the Second World War. These are all methods by which popular culture is attempting to come to terms with the monstrosity of its own constituents and of the history that it has just fled. Now, all of the other forms try to come up with some kind of, as I say, some kind of narrative or some kind of basis by which this coming to terms will take place. That punk, for instance, tries to de-repress the political subtexts of the world, and hip hop tries to de-repress the racial political struggle taking place in America specifically. But metal doesn't do that. Metal just shows you that this process is taking place at all. And I think that may be connected to it being the first on the scene. It's the first one to develop out of the back of rock broadly from the late 1960s, the first one to specialize. And I think perhaps it functions almost as an unconscious set of instructions to the other genres that follow it on this. What we're dealing with here in popular music is a way of a newly cognizant populace with access to mass media technology of dealing with the horrors of its own subjectivity in an era where not only have terrible things happened recently enough for our parents to remember them, but moreover, the idealism of the post-war moment has completely vanished and collapsed. And from here, we have the means to create culture, but we are sorely lacking in terms of a meta narrative, and each of these popular music discourses is an attempt to kind of reinstate one of those.
So I again want to poke around a little bit here.
Please.
And it seems to be in relationship to the way in which you're trying to frame metal as something special and unique in relationship to the other genres of contemporary post-World War II pop culture. And I want to say there's an element to your argument that I really agree with, and an element that I just have this temptation to complexify. So
Please.
let me start with your emphasis that a lot of autistic men are attracted to metal. And I want to connect that to the historical moment where there are psychoanalysts like Leon Brenner who are saying that autism is a new clinical category in psychoanalysis that requires a different mode of explanation than, let's say, the neurotic, the psychotic, or the pervert.
Mm.
And I also want to bring to the forefront that I think our historical moment, our historical age, as we actually discussed off recording, is seeing a revival of the theological question, a revival of the religious question, and that what I've seen in my own historical engagement with contemporary subjectivity is that a lot of autistic men are going towards fundamentalist religion.
Right.
And
Right.
And there's even a symptom right now of autistic men who don't know how to interact with women and who are confused about sexual difference and their place in the world, who are just strongly identifying with religion. And that what I want to propose to you is that if you're correct, that punk is the de-repression of the political, and if hip hop is the de-repression of race, or attempting to, all in the context of this post-World War II lack of a meta-narrative, that could it be that metal is trying to de-repress religion?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Yeah, and trying to I resuscitate it even is trying to resuscitate a corpse, because the writing is on the wall by the end of the 60s. Like people are, but I've read somewhere that I think Todd may have talked about this at one point on one of his pods, that people used to have this little book of Nietzsche in the 60s, and everyone had this like collection of aphorisms. It was just very common. By that point, unless you're willing to make the jump and take ownership of how your religion is politicized, as I think is seen in the evangelical movement from the 80s onwards, where they increasingly take on politics because they see that that is actually their place within the contemporary framework, is not to step outside of politics, but rather actually to become properly politicized. I think metal is trying to bring this corpse back to life, failing in the process. I would also add, it doesn't produce religion in the way that we have known it hereunto. It is very good at mobilizing a lot of the trappings of religion, but because it at some level, the producers of it on some level know its groundlessness. We don't get a good deity, basically. We get this kind of we get this little pantheon of the most famous musicians. But what we don't get is a kind of, there are no, and we do certainly get like a circulation of religious texts as well. And even there's a very good book about mysticism and drone metal, where the author contends that drone metal fulfills the kind of role that Hermetic societies would have regarding metal, because it's this kind of very meditative approach to the essential component of metal, which is distorted guitars. It's just about let it ring. And then all of the aesthetics in drone metal relate to pilgrimages, religious texts. People love wearing hooded robes and stuff on stage for that genre specifically. So metal's very good at mobilizing the trappings of religion, but I'm tentative as to whether it fully de-represses religion. As I say, in my understanding, the thing that it's very good at de-repressing is actually the psychodynamics of musical enjoyment, which, to be fair, we should be charitable enough to understand that the psychodynamics of enjoyment are precisely the cut and stuff of religion anyway.
Yes. No, so there's this line from Nietzsche that I'm coming to mind, which is something like life wouldn't be worth living if it wasn't for music, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like that. And so it's this, that what makes our life bearable, what makes it possible to go on in some sense, is that I'm walking with music. And I think that, like, on a day-to-day phenomenological level, me and my brother have the same sensibilities here, which is that at almost, I don't know if it's 50%, I don't know if it's 75% of my day, I have music by my side, so to speak. I'm walking with music. And even when I'm studying, when I'm reading, I'll have certain classical music, or when I'm walking around, or when I'm working out, or something like that, I'll have other types of genres of music, but I'm walking with music in some sense. It's the psychodynamics of musical enjoyment which give that little, which is almost like the excess of life, the less than nothing of life, which allows me to keep going. And that's where I like the idea of Zizek, et per si muove, and yet it moves. Music makes that possible. Music unlocks that. And
And
I just want to say, before throwing it back to you, get your point, is that on regards to this 1960s writing on the wall, in regards to the de-repression of religion, and everyone in the 60s walking around with the Nietzsche book and the collection of aphorisms, that in the 1960s, Nietzsche was transgressive, but I think today Nietzsche is the norm. And as a consequence of that, something like metal is maybe bringing to our attention, not only, as you say in your work, the failure of the sort of hippie countercultural aesthetic as a solution, but that the journey towards figuring out what life is like beyond the death of God has only just begun. That's sort of
yeah,
an idea, but I'd love to get your thoughts on some of these themes.
yeah, I think that's really true, because like I, I think we're still nowhere near appreciating what a fundamental break the postmodern from the modern is, and how radically we have subjectivity has changed in such a short period of time. And right now, is metal appreciates the kind of god of a god of the real, or a god of zero almost. Like it's okay, it coheres around death, lacking, etc., as a way of communicating how the bottom has fallen out of all of the meta narratives that Leotard identifies. And I think we're in a we have we're not unsure currently as to how metal is going to proceed through this, because it has so much, and to be fair, how the other popular music genres are going to proceed through this, because for now they're so tightly bound to capitalist modes of production, and as such they are diminished, made silly. The seriousness is constantly being undermined and ironized by the capitalist recuperative machine. For instance, there is an advert that just came out this year where it's for a girls' makeup brand, and it features a black metal musician in the full corpse paint, and they were selling a limited edition corpse paint for little girls product. Now, this has the effect of normalizing, of making this process of appreciating the death of God into something that actually it's not that important. It's not really a worthwhile struggle to focus on. Just enjoy the slurry, buy the makeup, and move on and play. Just which is the typical postmodern orthodoxy of, we have made the world a giant playground for you. Just enjoy it. Don't think about it. Just enjoy it. I think the real benefit, though, of metal as it has matured and become less teenage, as the audience the musicians have got older, and also as the subgenre world has developed and then kind of filled itself out, and the gaps have started to fill in, is that metal has become increasingly intellectual. There's a downside to this too, is that metal is much more middle class than it used to be, and has much more, and to some extent has more elitist connotations than it did in the 70s or in the 80s. But overall, it points towards a future in which metal is, and I'm beginning to write a paper on this, where I argue at the end that the way forward for metal, certainly as regards politics, is that we need to stop considering metal as popular music and actually start to consider it as prestige music, in the same way that Western classical or jazz have been considered. We actually need the state to get much more involved in metal and fund it, because it is precisely occupying the site of an intellectual music that was taken up by jazz at the end of its development, and then also Western art music before it. These are musics for contemplation, for understanding. Simultaneously, they are also for bashing people's heads against each other, running around in a field and drinking until you throw up. Fine, but I mean, at best, a future culture would be able to appreciate the real unity of those two poles and not see them as a dualism. But yes, I think as we proceed forward, metal may lose. I'm not sure how it's going to respond to on the religious question. I'm not sure whether a church of metal will really develop. I think perhaps certainly the first three generations would probably find that a bit too puerile. But
Not a church of metal, but churches that use and explore metal.
now that, I think, is going to become more common, and we're actually seeing practical examples of that over the past couple of years. There is a project funded and run by none other than a metal scholar at the University of Huddersfield, and they did a performance in a church just last year. A metal gig in a church, and off the back of that, a bunch of churches have started to offer similar things to other local metal bands, because nobody's going to church anymore. But you do know who appreciates a good old church building? Metal fans. We love history and we love looking at old buildings, and because we're nerds and we enjoy that kind of thing. So actually, I think we're going to get an unintentional unity of religious structures and metal. But then I think that should be taken further, and the state should properly take responsibility for metal, as it should for other popular musics. But metal is conventionally among the most maligned, so I feel the need to overstate that.
Where I see an unusual potential unity is, and this I'll throw it back to you very quickly, is how lame rock music is done in mega churches versus the potential of some really serious artistic aesthetic expression of metal music and the anguish of the universal negativity and the death of God that's explored in metal, as it were, in a deep collision. Like I'm thinking here about those mega churches in the United States that have these very lame sort of empty forms of like pop rock music, but at the same time the potential of the depth of the object voice that is explored in metal, almost to really foreground the pain and the monstrosity of the subject in this situation. I don't know, do you think there's a unity there, if you've seen any?
There are good precedents for this, and they're all metal as fuck. Hieronymus Bosch, I think, no clearer example of where this impulse towards memento mori, but also just wanton destruction and abhorrent abjection, all of these forms that don't make sense and seem to be radically against what we ordinarily perceive. There are precedents for this in liturgical writing and art already, and even in music at points. I think at the darkest moments of various composers' requiems get there, for instance. But it's going to be a long struggle between contemporary religious organizations who are very much part of the repressive state apparatus versus this potential for a state religion that can properly acknowledge the bleakness and darkness of the world and the subjectivity into which one is thrown. I think there's and that's precisely why I feel the need to make this, like, I think, unconventional argument that rather than metal being handed over ever more to proudly independent producers, people who can say that they're somehow outside of ideology or outside of the system, I think we need to have a Hegel going to Jena kind of moment or to Berlin, sorry, Hegel to Berlin kind of moment where metal is properly taken on as a responsibility of the state. So I think in a way, more normalization of metal, please. So much normalization that it can then be actually put to use rather than being seen as this pointless appendage to popular music culture that only exists as one scholar put it in the early 90s, a nihilistic dreamboat to negation. I want to put it the other way around. Yes, it is the nihilistic dreamboat to negation, and that has plenty of uses.
Well, I think that we found a really interesting spot here, because we did take the time to historically unpack metal. We did go through that little bit of a conversation where we're talking about metal as the enjoyment of transgression towards metal as enjoyment as such, and even explored a little bit the fact that metal finds its origin in the lack of the law. And now we find ourselves with you arguing that actually metal needs to be state sponsored, and that metal should find its home within institutions like the state and religion. However, what's ambiguous to me is, my modern sensibilities of the separation of church and state. And what's ambiguous to me here is the way you're thinking about the relation between church, state, and metal. Do you see this as politically orienting toward the unity of church and state, or do you see this as tending on one side or the other, or how are you making sense of that?
I'm more of a statist. My theory on this for a few years has been basically Todd's book on enjoying what we don't have. His 2013 book really opened me up to the question of what does a society after capitalism enjoy like? How does it go about enjoyment? And it's one of the fundamental questions which troubles socialism. So many socialists are very are pot committed to the idea of a utopia of some form where the problems of enjoyment are done away with. The issues, the ethical issues attendant to how we consume culture, and also of the trouble that we cause for ourselves. For so many utopian socialists, this is a project which will mysteriously, magically resolve itself the day after the revolution. For me, metal offers an interesting potential for a equivalent almost to classical to Western art music, to classical music, after a revolutionary period, because it highlights and upholds negative universality rather than a positive universality. It upholds much more the idea that we don't know what we're doing. We are lost in a world beyond our comprehension. The only certainty really is that you are going to not be alive at some point. And out of that, it should emerge the virtue of care, should emerge the idea of a proper community that encompasses the not all, rather than trying to count everybody up.
So
It probably deals with how even if we did count everyone up, there would still be the missing pieces of what to do.
So I love that, and the way you're talking about it, it reminds me of Peter Rollins' Church of the Contradiction, but also more on the level of the secular state as opposed to the religious theological dimension. And as a consequence of that, it makes a lot of sense to me that you're interested in enjoyment after capitalism towards the question of socialism and taking metal music more in that direction.
Mhm.
Now, the question and sort of the leading point that I would like us to discuss towards, as it were, the quilting point or the closure of this conversation is in the direction of the way in which you and your work choose to mobilize the distinctions between pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. And
Okay.
how
Yeah.
all of that fits here and whether or not you think metal as a as you state in your work, there's a contradict that metal appears as a contradiction of modernism and postmodernism, and where that contradiction seems to point for you is negative universality, and whether or not that negative universality is then further symbolized beyond the distinction of of postmodernism and modernism in something like a category. I know some people use the term metamodernism, and whether or not you relate to that concept or whether you think that's a false pathway or how you approach the direction of this contradiction, basically.
Cool. I'm not a meta modernist. That seems to me to be too easy a quilting point, and I like things that are hard. I have one of my favorite things about metal is that it's not just heavy, it's also hard, like hard rock. And hard doesn't just mean tough, it also means difficult. Probably unnecessary, and in metal's case, unnecessarily difficult. Like we like things to be harder than they should be, which is very Hegelian, I think. Now, the contradiction that I identified that metal has, or how it operates as a site of contradiction, is that on the one hand, the material that it draws on is all about pre-modernity. It's a fascination with antiquity that even outstrips, I think, the romanticism of early modernism. It's so obsessed with digging back into farther and farther into the remains of what has been, but it does it in a very postmodern way. It doesn't approach the material properly. Instead, where do our great metal musicians find all of their inspiration to write about historical events? Comics, movies, pulp fiction, etc. Nowadays, probably video games as well. The trash of low to middle culture, not with academic rigor. Now, there are some exceptions to this. I presented at a conference called Heavy Metal and Global Pre-Modernity earlier this year, and some of the bands that the presenters brought up, they had done their fucking homework. They had gone away and read all this stuff, maybe even at an academic level. Some of them are academics and so on. But overall, the way that metal approaches pre-modernity is in a very postmodern way, where it's always mediated by mass culture. But that doesn't mean that it's just a polarity between the two, because then metal also has the values that metal seems to operate on and its general cut and thrust are decidedly modernist. There's a great focus on attempting authenticity. As I mentioned, there's also an emphasis on struggle, making things harder, turning your life into an epic confrontation between the impossible nothing and the defiant human subject. It's very, very and also the figure in metal of the auteur creator, the person who can do it all, who can run their own project from their bedroom, despite it being an incredibly complicated piece of music or whatever. Now, this contradiction means that metal never runs smoothly in postmodernity. Even I think it acts as a kind of a sort of, maybe even a kind of constitutive gap within popular culture. It shows a path to the real, but frankly, far be it from me to say where that contradiction leads us. I see their potentials, but these have to be seized. These actually have to be taken on by by a future communist project. They have to accept that metal has to come along for the ride just as much as the popular musics that have good rational bases are obviously along for the ride. Because obviously punk is communist. Obviously. No doubt about it. And obviously, hip hop and socialism make great bedfellows in loads of cases, and there's a whole history of early hip hop which was very socialistic. Metal has to come too, is my point. Despite how reactionary it seems on the face of it. And this is because it operates as this uneasy, non fitting part of culture which necessarily must be included in any socialist project. It is not sufficient to take the culture that fits neatly and rationally with one's ideology. It is also required that we bring with us the cultures that, on the face of it, are dislikable, irrational, and problematic. Not just because of this kind of, oh, well, we need to take history along with us, it doesn't do to forget. But no, metal I would suggest metal would continue to be instructive and important long after this point, precisely because it articulates how the subject, even under socialism, will not fit.
All right, so I'm glad you brought this up because it's the low key. I think it's the reason why I was trying to push on the particularist universal angle, and that like sort of there's this idea that metal has in some ways purified itself of its particularity towards this universal negativity of the object voice, but in that process we've lost the condition of possibility for conversation with the other genres, which for whatever reason, better or worse, cling to a certain particularity, whether that's punk, whether that's hip hop, whether that's, I don't know, if dance and electronic is where to situate that. But that if we are to think about music within the horizon of politics, and if we are to think about music as playing some role in the dialectic from capitalism to socialism to communism, then we're going to have to think about the ways in which all of this ecology, this musical field, is playing its role as a means towards an end. And I think that is also something that comes up in your work, and actually is a good opportunity to frame an argument that you make in one of your papers about metal and the object voice not being an end in itself, but a means towards an end. And so I would say that, and this is what I throw at you, is that in this process, in this political process, what is the political potential of dance, electronic, punk, hip hop, and metal, and for them to, on all levels, approach the relationship between particularity and universality? That we can't have a universality stripped of particularity, and we can't have a particularity stripped of universality. But we need to think particularity and universality together, and we need to think about all of these forms of music not as an end in itself, but as a means towards an end. And on metal's side, we do have the scream, we do have the anguish of our moment. In hip hop, I do think we have the struggles of differentiation and the play of signifiers. On the punk side, we do have the challenge of the ethical system. And on the level of dance and electronic music, we do have the, as it were, the primordial body without organ. We do have the body as such that has escaped capture by signifiers. So all of these play a role here and are expressing a certain dimension of the subject, but it's just an aspect of where do you find yourself in this sort of not fitting in the aftermath of World War II and the struggle of the particular and the universal in our historical moment.
Yeah, and I think this is why one of the reasons that I mentioned the autism thing earlier is because one of my pet theories is that people's preferred pop music fandom is a strong indicator as to something in their as to their rough psychic profile, basically, as to their rough psychic stance. And metal attracts people who like things to be completely de-repressed, who just hate who can't deal with repression because they don't understand, so largely because they don't understand social cues. Whereas people who are punks are hysterics, they like railing. against the system. They like going up to the big other and waving the finger about and saying fuck you and making a challenge and so on and so forth. So I think not I haven't committed overly to fully theorizing that out, but I absolutely agree that all of these pieces have to come with us as we proceed through capitalism and into a different kind of economy. And this gives me a brief aside to mention my ideal structure of culture and government, which is how do we deal with the problem of enjoyment after capitalism? My suggestion is once we have dealt with scarcity and need, these things which really as should be a given, those should be the social givens, in fact, is that all needs are met. We're going to have a lot of free time, especially in the West. We're already seeing a lot of perhaps too much free time, which is currently just being filled up with consumptive boredom. Now, what I want to suggest in replacement is that everybody is mandated to have an annoying hobby like being in a band, being in theatre, being a writer, blah blah blah, some kind of creative pursuit, and all the genres, of course, have to come with us as part of this. And then, so you all have your pursuits, and then every night, rather than work, you have your new job, which is you have to go round the houses watching other people's creative projects, going to their garden shows, going to the premieres of your mate's play, and you have to write little reviews on everything that you go to, and you submit that to the government, and that's how you get paid. Now, this would deal quite neatly with the problems of boredom and enjoyment that we currently see. It would also generate much more a sense of communitas and of collectivity, because you'd actually have to appreciate other people's work rather than just being stuck in your house all day watching the same 3 or 4 fucking YouTube channels like somebody over here does all the time. But rather than that, we would have a genuine engagement, but it would still suck. We would be tired all the time because we'd be out late every night watching somebody's gig. Everyone would be a culture wanker. Everyone would be a snob, having all of these annoying arguments that the chattering classes so love to have about the itty bitties of whether somebody's guitar solo is better than another's, or how well the geraniums were outlaid in somebody's flower show, or whatever the fuck it is. But this would be much better trouble for us to be engaged with than the troubles of meeting need. And my essential gambit there is that the Lacanian psychic structure is such that we're never going to be properly free of these troubles, these internal torsions. So we need to find a better game by which to satisfy them. And what better, really, than having people all get to do the hobby that they would like to do, the creative pursuit that they would actually like to engage in, but it's not something that you're on your own for. Everybody in the village or the town has to come and watch your stupid shit. That for me is the dream, and we cannot have that without bringing all of the varieties of genre, troublesome as all of them are. We cannot have that without bringing all of them into the future.
Well, I think that's a great way to end, and it's a very creative socialist or communist governmental ideal or state ideal, but I do think that these are the types of speculative ideas that people should be thinking up, and we should have spaces to discuss them in the future. So I hope that, yeah, maybe we can open up those conversations in the future between the two of us, or we find our own ways to explore them in our work. But I just want to really emphasize for the viewers that this conversation is inspired by concrete work that you're doing on the level of your doctoral project, and to also remind everyone that links to your academic work will be in the description so they can check that out. I guess the last thing I'll just ask, if there's anywhere where people can find your work, or any place where people can get in touch with you if they're interested in diving deeper with you, where would they find you?
You can find me on Twitter at metal_analysis. Also, check out my band. We're called Absent Signifier, and we play free metal. That's free jazz with extreme metal. So come and check out my vague forays into Lacanian metal as we go. But yes, find me on Twitter at metal_analysis. I also have a YouTube channel, my name, David Burke. You can find a couple of little talks on there as well. And yeah, thank you so much, Kedal. That was brilliant. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, this has been David Burke, psychoanalysis, Lacan, metal music, and thanks for everyone who's watching us. Philosophy Portal is a live event space. Every month, we host 4 live events dedicated to making philosophy actual. Our network is designed to explore the philosophy of sexuality, community, and metaphysics, as well as introduce you to some of the key thinkers in the underground theory scene. Members get access to the entire history of the live event space, as well as first access to special Philosophy Portal events. In the portal, we also encourage couples, as well as physical meetups when and where possible. If you are looking for a real thinking space, arguably the best thinking space online, check out philosophyportal.online and become a member today.